Paul Evans, we are so excited to have you join us. You're one of the soothsayers of this industry. You're one of our Nostradamuses out there. It is so good to talk to you. I want to thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you, Michael. It's always a pleasure. Great to be here.
So let's jump right in. Decentralization, it's the buzzword. Everybody's talking about it. I'm not sure if everybody's talking about the same thing. What do you see as the state of play for decentralization in clinical trials right now?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, isn't it? If you were to land from Mars and all you had access to was LinkedIn and one or two other websites, you'd think that the whole industry is about to be completely turned on its head by decentralization, or in fact, it already has been, and that's where we're going. It's clearly a direction of travel. There's no doubt in that. But I think there's probably more talk at the moment than there is action. And what's quite interesting around that is when I talk to IRBs, the amount of studies that they're seeing that are including decentralized components, or a significant amount, let's say, of decentralized components, is still quite low. So that's probably an indication that it's still not as ingrained as people would have you believe. But there's no question we're going that way. A lot of the noise is driven by tech, of course, in this space. There's a lot of new tech out there. A lot of it's exciting. A lot of it's maybe not quite ready for prime time yet. But like a lot of tech-driven industries, or in this case, it's an activity. Sometimes the drivers for that aren't necessarily the things that we'd want driving the industry. In other words, sometimes it's about the finances and who's trying to push what idea. But there's no doubt that there's a lot going on, and there's a lot to be excited about. It's just not as advanced as some people would have you believe. And it reminds me a lot, showing my age now, Michael, but it reminds me a lot of the early days of EDC in our industry, late 90s, early 21st century. It took 20 years for EDC to get rolled out through our industry. We're an evolution, not revolution type of industry. And that's kind of what I'm seeing with DCT. We're going in that direction. The real question we all have to ask ourselves is how quickly? And I don't think that's clear yet.
You and I talked about this before, this famous COVID catalyst. It's real. It forced the industry to do a lot of things. A lot of things have stood the test of time or appear to. And as you just sort of said, we're an evolution. We're a relatively risk-averse industry for good reason. But what kind of impact did COVID have, a lasting impact, do you think, here?
Yeah, and again, I think the simple answer is COVID was behind a lot of what happened with DCT, but I think it's more nuanced than that. I mean, COVID, and let's hope none of us ever have to go through that again. But COVID drove all sorts of change that had to happen because we were in a genuine crisis and we needed quick answers. So a lot got thrown at the problem of getting the COVID vaccines on the market. But what people shouldn't lose sight of either is a lot of money got spent around that. And a lot of what happened through COVID, a lot of the things that were rolled out, also had a lot of resource put behind them. In other words, they were expensive. Our experience of the site business was, and I've even read some press releases from companies that said, this is what we did in COVID. And I look at it sometimes and think, yeah, we were on the receiving end of that. And it wasn't necessarily ready for what you did. But what we all did, the sponsors, the CROs, the sites, is we all threw a lot of resource at it because there was a lot of money supporting that. And we got it done. But you can't keep doing that. And I think what we're already beginning to see is things beginning to swing back. It's no longer at any cost. It's now, yes, this is the direction we want to go in, but it's also got to be cost effective. And so I think it's becoming more normal, or things are reverting to the norm. I think there's nothing wrong with that as such. We just have to be sure that we don't just go back to old ways, the no going back movement. And I don't think it will, but I don't think COVID was the massive change agent that everyone believes, or at least it was a more nuanced change agent.
Not such a lasting, maybe. So you've talked about sites a little bit. Obviously, that's your perspective. I think there's an irony here sometimes in DCT that the site perspective might be a little bit overlooked. Talk a little bit about how what the site's view of DCT, and they're obviously going to be integral to its success or failure.
Yeah, and I think sometimes even coming from a site's perspective, Michael, I sometimes believe the site view can be a little bit jaundiced. I kind of understand that. If you go right back to the early days of DCT, some people rashly started talking about siteless trials, and sites are going away and we don't need sites anymore. I heard all of those things in the last decade. That's probably not the case, of course. There are different site models out there which are kind of interesting, but the idea that we're going to run siteless trials, with the exception of a very, very small number at the margins, that's not really what's going to happen. The second thing that sites see as a consequence of the DCT focus is back to the point I was making about tech. It's all tech supported, it's all tech enabled. And of course, that's, well, if you're being cynical, that's inflicted on sites. It's usually not the site's choice in the first place. Every sponsor has their own view. And again, as I said earlier, some of those solutions are great, and some of them really are still not quite ready for prime time. And probably very few of them, if any, have been designed with the site in mind. So what sites are seeing is the burden of technology rather than the benefit of technology. So, that sometimes leaves sites feeling, this is being inflicted upon us. We're seeing the negative aspects of DCT. Again, I think that will change. And I think some sites have been a little overly jaundiced in their view of things. My perception, running a business where we've acquired a lot of sites and looked at a lot of sites, research sites generally, are not as technology sophisticated as some other businesses. So, having this burden placed upon them when they're possibly the least qualified in the ecosystem to deal with it, adds to the problem. So I think some of those negatives have been perceived by the sites and have made them a little reluctant. But I think overall, sites recognize that at the end of the day, the real promise of DCT is greater patient choice and greater patient flexibility. If that's the case, sites are fully supportive of it. And I suspect the answer in the long term is going to be the hybrid approach. So sites are going to be engaged in this no matter what we think.
Clearly, we need to hear the sites have a louder voice in this chorus, if you will, don't you think?
Yes, but again, I kind of understand why that's difficult. You've got to remember that there are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of sites globally, and we're in a global industry. The epicenter of DCT right now is the US, I would say, but it's a global industry. Not only are there hundreds of thousands of sites, maybe, but they churn. Right, a lot of investigators get involved in clinical research. Then they, the one and dones. We're all familiar with that. We've all expended hours of interview time like this talking about the one and dones and why they are. But that makes it difficult when you want to get the site perspective. Of course, you can come to multi-site organizations like Velocity and others like us, but we're a subset, and a small subset, probably only 1 or 2% of the market. So we have a view. The view of your single site doing 1 or 2 studies a year is probably different to ours. So it's not easy to know where you go and get that from. We have organizations like SCRS and ACRP who can give a view. And I think that's extremely valid. And both of those organizations do a great job representing the site view. But it's not, if you're a single sponsor, not easy to know where to go to get that sort of site perspective.